All right. So, dear colleagues, I would like to welcome you to today's BRIA's research seminar. And we have two presentations today, actually very closely related presentations. The first one will be given by Dr. Kata Dozsa, if I pronounce that correctly, and the second one by Dr. Catherine Throssell over here. So it is my honor to introduce Kata. Kata is a postdoctoral researcher at the Brussels School of Governance, where she conducts empirical research on the Curiae Virides ERC project on transnational ecological litigation. Her research focuses on children's rights, intergenerational justice, and climate change, and Kata is the author of the book Children as Climate Citizens, published by Routledge in 2023. She has also published extensively on issues related to long-term decision-making. She was awarded the 2022 Sustainable Research Award for her contribution to climate change policy development in Belgium, and it is therefore my distinct honor to invite Kata to the stage, well, she's actually already at the stage, for her presentation on children as climate citizens, presentism with long-term interests. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gia, for the introduction. I realized that I forgot to put my, because I brought this book that my presentation will be based on, so if you guys want to have a look, you're absolutely welcome. Thank you very much again. Welcome, everyone. As Didier said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and my research has been long focusing on children's rights in the climate change context. And I focus mainly on participation, access to justice, and access to information of children. And these rights are the basis of children's citizen rights, so to speak. And today I will introduce you the concept of children as climate citizens. And I will focus mainly on the intergenerational aspects of this concept and the tensions, but also the reconciliation or the bridge between the present interests of children and the long-term interests of young people, children, in the climate change context. So, yes, this is what I just talked about, sorry. At the last point, I would really like to focus mainly on the legal solutions. I am a lawyer by training. I don't know, how many of you are lawyers here? Oh, that's wonderful. So I hope you will enjoy my insights from a different angle. I brought you mainly the litigation area to discuss, and how intergenerational justice in litigation manifests, especially when children are actors in litigation, and how the courts play a role in providing a bridge between presentism, long-termism in climate governance. So why do we talk about children in the climate change governance context in the first place? Currently, more than 1 billion children, nearly half of the world's child population, live in extremely high-risk countries. And of course, children who are living in the present are already experiencing the impacts of climate change, but they also will experience it throughout the life course. These are all stated by many scientific studies, which we all know about. These scientific studies discuss the disproportionate exposure and the vulnerability of children living today, and also throughout the life course, the cumulative effects and the unequal impacts of climate change on children, and that it can be also irreversibly impacting children's lives. So, but when we talk about children in the climate context, we also think about the intergenerational inequalities how will they experience climate change in their future, and their children and their children. And there are many responses to these type of intergenerational considerations, social and economic and democratic responses, where children are actually involved or affected by these responses. And then, of course, when we talk about intergenerational considerations, we think about duty bearers and their obligations to consider, recognize children's vulnerability and children's situation in the current climate context, but also in the long term. And that creates a conflict. But before we will talk about the conflict itself between children's present and long-term interests, I would like to clarify the term of children or child, which is a legal term in the first place. It is defined by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 1, and it says that a child or children as a group are persons below the age of 18 years. And of course, there are other approaches to children and young people in the participation context. And this will gain significance when we talk about how children get involved in governance processes or citizenship activities. Adolescents are defined by the Committee on the Rights of the Child at the United Nations level. Why? Because the committee recognized that there is an age group where children demonstrate more capability and also more willingness or interest to participate in public matters. So they provide more space, if you like, more legal space and more institutionalized space to young people between the age of 10 and 18 to express their views in matters that concern them. And youth is a very interesting term. It's not a legal term. It's very important because we often hear about youth participation simultaneously as a synonym for child participation, but it's not the same. So what is youth? Youth is a policy term, a policy-based term, mainly created by the United Nations system, governance system, but it has been adopted by regional policies and national policies as well. It applies to young people in the first place between 15 and 25, but in reality, this shifts between 18 and even up to 35. And why is it important for children? Because if in reality youth applies to young people above the age of 18, they are discriminated against. They are not going to be able to participate in youth activities as such in governance processes. Okay, so what does climate citizenship mean and how does it apply to children? So in my book, I discuss this concept as an active concept for children being involved in climate change matters. So I apply it to all children, but mainly those who are interested in environmental issues, who have or feel an affiliation or responsibility towards nature, other human beings, environmental protection. But it also has a long-term effect of citizenship, of active citizenship for children, because they experience democratic values, they experience being involved in public matters, and they can sustain it in society throughout their lifetime, and they can also provide that to their own children in the future. So for society and for children as well, this citizenship concept is a beneficial, or citizenship activity is a beneficial activity. It is also an abstract concept, so it's not linked to the national sovereignty, and it's important because we are political scientists mainly. So the citizenship here is not to be understood as a concept based on the national sovereignty or national context, but more as a geographical, global concept that reaches beyond borders, both physically and digitally, for example. So it connects people around the world, and that's why I apply it as a global concept for children as climate citizens. And then it's also a rights-based concept. Why? Because children do have rights that are considered to be citizens' rights or political rights, freedom rights. They have these rights set forth by the United Nations Convention and also other regional treaties. But these rights are usually associated with adult activities. The right to association, the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, the right to information and to participation in governance. So these rights can be only practiced by children if they are empowered. They need the institutional context to be able to experience this and to fulfill these rights. And because children haven't reached the age of majority and the age of voting citizenship, they cannot go to the ballot box, they cannot participate directly or influence directly the political decision making. They find and explore different pathways of expressing their views, of participating and influencing climate change governance. How? For example, they participate in conferences, public debates, citizens' assemblies, or in protests in the streets. They establish grassroots movements. They are involved, or they sue governments, and they are involved in climate change litigation. But there are many other ways of practicing citizenship rights in the context of climate change. In my book, I concentrate on these three main avenues: high-level conferences at the global level, at the United Nations level, the grassroots movement activism, starting with the Fridays for Future, but shifting also to digital spaces, online spaces, social media. And the last avenue is the litigation. And today, I will focus more on the litigation. Before I do that, I want to highlight that in the book, I explore both the rights-based, the institutionalized framework for children to be able to participate in climate matters, but also the social context. How is it actually realized in life? And I find that even though children do have, why didn't it switch, sorry? Yeah. Even though children do have the rights, and also they are recognized as stakeholders. They do have institutionalized spaces, for example, in the United Nations system, as children and youth groups. They still have to face with many, many obstacles and constraints. And why? Because their capability is always questioned. Their age is always questioned. The age provides also the vulnerability and the responsibility to protect them. And because of that, many adult-led institutions, adult-led fora, spaces, they are not willing to provide spaces for children to come in because they are afraid of this obligation to protect children in these spaces. So there are a lot of different issues to consider, but also how children experience their situation, their obstacles, but also if they participate these processes, whether they experience it as a meaningful or a tokenistic and instrumentalized process, whether they actually have a chance to exert influence on the decision making, or they are absolutely marginalized or overlooked, whether they are included or discriminated against. And in the book, I have, in each chapter, I bring in questions on what happens if we consider, for example, tokenism as a basis for children to be able to find other avenues of participation, triggering other alternatives, such as, for example, participating instead of conference and going to high-level conferences, participating in local initiatives or citizen assemblies. Or what if children have a more radical response to being rejected from these spaces? There are many studies now, and also suggestions that radical responses from children can lead to more influence. So that's also something to consider. And then, of course, I also go around the question, so why are children even there? What is the main reason and the purpose? And one of the reasons and the purpose, so the goal of their participation is the intergenerational justice. So children tend to set 2 or 3 goals when they participate, according to my research. One is that to express their views. The second is to be heard, and their voice is to be considered, so basically to have an influence on the decisions. And the third one is to represent other vulnerable groups, especially those who they feel affiliated with. And this is one of the groups is the future generations. And they tend to feel responsible. They tend to act as stewards for future generations. But when, as a lawyer, I look at how does this work? How do children represent? What is the legitimacy of children representing future generations? First, I come across with the question, what are the future generations? Who are children actually representing? Are they the same? Are future generations the same as children? How many of you think that they can be identified, these two groups, together? So children are the future generations. Or they have an overlap. Yeah. So it's a question of interpreting it. Why? Because future generations are not defined legally. So we don't know who are exactly the future generations. I brought you this quote from a child plaintiff from a court case from the United States. And this really illustrates there's so much confusion about children being responsible for future generations, identifying themselves with future generations. So we are the future. Decision makers will be long gone before the long-term effects of climate change ever hit them. It's about my kids, it's about their grandkids. But in the first line, it says, it's hard for legal experts to deny the rights of young people. He's talking about their current rights, their rights in the present, and then it goes on to discuss the future generations and their kids, and it's so confusing. And this is how children are seen, not only in the legal context, but also in the political context. I took out a picture from my slides, but I will quickly just mention it. At the United Nations level, when they hold these COP meetings, etc., they usually talk about youth and future generations in the same cluster. They used to talk about children and youth in the same cluster. Now it's about youth and future generations. So a lot of political interest there in the background as well. There are two soft law documents that have attempted to clarify the distinction between children and youth. But yes, they both agree that there is an overlap, or there is a close relationship between children and future generation, except that children's present experiences, the harms or risks they suffer from climate change, should be considered separately than those of future generations. And of course, both papers, both soft law documents discuss the duties or the obligations of duty bearers to consider children's interests in the present and not just in the long term. So we arrived, yes?
Clarification about the term duty bearers. Can you maybe unpack it a little bit?
When I refer to duty bearers, yeah, it's I refer to those stakeholders, governances and businesses and other duty bearers, actors who are responsible for climate change in the first place, but also who are responsible to take action on climate impacts. This is the map, not exhaustive list of litigation worldwide that includes children as plaintiffs. It's from 2024. Obviously, the number of these cases have increased. We're talking now about 50, 60 cases worldwide out of the more than 3,000-4,000 cases, climate cases altogether. So it's a small proportion of the climate cases, but these cases are significant because they receive a lot of media attention. Why? Because when children participate, it's all about vulnerability, it's all about intergenerational justice, the rights of future generations, and these are milestone cases in climate litigation. Strategic climate litigation have moral elements when we consider intergenerational justice. They are brought because they want to include the marginalized. They want to give space to the voiceless, including children and the future generations. And on that point, I would like to highlight that children are actors who do have voice, who can express their views, in contrast to future generations who don't and who need to be represented. These cases, these litigation cases, always frame time for the present, but also for the future. So they talk about we need to act now, we need to consider the future consequences. Climate change is an emergency or it's a crisis now, and that we also have to provide the rights and equity and justice throughout the children's lifetime or in the future for the next generations. And these cases also aim to achieve social change. And now we have arrived to the conflict between presentism and long-termism, but strategic climate litigation is a tool to actually bridge these two issues. So as far as I understand, but please correct me, presentism from the political science perspective is when decision makers consider present interests of the society or certain groups of the society, as opposed to those living in the long run or coming after them. So as opposed to the future generations, so to speak. But in climate change litigation, when children are acting as plaintiffs, there is always a question whether their rights should be considered in the present or in the long run. And courts tend to play the role of bridging this gap. First of all, they don't, legally, since future generations are not a legal entity, courts tend to avoid providing standing to future generations, as opposed to children. So in many cases, children do get the standing. And they can argue for their own rights, for the harms climate inflicts on them in the present. And courts look at scientific facts, how this happens. And then they also look at the obligations of duty bearers, states, governments, or businesses or other duty bearers, and in many cases, courts have looked at the obligation of states to take immediate action today, in the present, considering the long-term effects of these decisions. The Klima Signorinen case, I'm sure many of you have heard about it, was brought to the European Court of Human Rights, and this was a milestone ruling from the court. I brought you this case not because children were involved in it, but because children were mentioned along with future generations in the ruling as vulnerable groups and groups that are disproportionately being disproportionately affected by climate change impacts. And because this ruling said that the Swiss government must act or take immediate action and set binding intermediate emission reductions targets. So in this ruling, in the last paragraph, you can already see that the court is really bridging the present interests with the long-term interests. And now going back to children. So there is a lot of discussion about what is really the role of children in these cases and whether they should be involved in climate change litigation, whether this is the right place for them to be. And in terms of intergenerational justice, I discuss children's role in my publications as carrying the so-called intergenerational burden. So embodying future generations, being the face and the advocates or the stewards for future generations in these cases, it usually, it's a very sensitive line between children acting on their own behalf or having to play the role of advocating for future interests of the society. It's a very risky role that children are involved in climate change litigation. And of course, the problem is that in many cases, the court dismisses the cases and the unclarity remains between the interests and between also the definition of future generation and the current, the present generations and how, so there is a blurred line between future generations and the presently living children. And that often remains. The litigation cases don't really solve this problem many times. They are also risking of creating interest groups. And of course, when I talk about this in my book and also in other publications, I always highlight the problem that children cannot be conflicted with the interests of future generations. But what the court does is that they immediately look at the distinction between children and future generations and decide, are we going to look at children today and the current harm they suffer, or are we going to look at their future interests and the interests of future generations? And it creates a tension between children themselves and what they are actually representing. These litigations also tend to instrumentalize children, so many times there are a few cases where children actively or proactively get involved in litigation, but in most cases it's the lawyers or the organizations who launch these cases who invite children, who select certain activist children or other impacted children to be on board in these litigations. And there we can talk about the risk of instrumentalization and also shifting the burden of representing future generations to children. Yes, and of course, children being involved in litigation can accelerate further risks, such as being disappointed at the outcome of these cases, which in most of the cases, it's a dismissal by the courts. Children can feel fatigue, disappointment, they can turn to radicalization, or they can develop mental health issues, such as anxiety or depression. They are exposed to the media attention. So a lot of ethical issues to be considered. And of course, also whether children can actually participate actively in these cases. Most of the courts don't hear the kids. So even they cannot even enter the courtroom. For example, in the European Court of Human Rights, there was a case launched by Portuguese children. They were present. It gained a huge media attention, and the court hearing itself, only lawyers spoke in the hearing, and there was no interpretation provided for children, translation. So what are we talking about when we talk about children being involved in climate change litigation? And of course, we have to highlight the positive impact of children having a part and practicing their citizenship rights in being involved in legal processes. They can learn about their rights and duties. These cases sometimes clarify the term between children and future generations, and they can also mutually benefit. These interest groups mutually benefit from the outcome of these clarifications. And I refer back to the Klima Signorinen case, which I explained you before, that even though children were not involved in that case, the court ruling had implication on children's interests and children's rights, and that the government should consider vulnerable groups. So the case had future implications, intergenerational implications on the rights of future generations, but the court extended it to children. So that's when I talk about mutual benefits, this is what I refer to. And then, children feel empowered. They can act as citizens. They can learn about responsibility, altruism, and representation. And the final question is whether these cases can actually trigger social change, awareness in the broader society, and ultimately whether they can influence governance. And then, I would like to conclude with this picture. It's created by an artist, Professor Esther Six from the United States. She created it at the Arctic, printed this message on the snow, and the message came from a young person of the age of 16. And it's, I hope we can leave a world behind that we are proud of, with clean air, soil, and water. I wish for the future generations to see and experience the snow. And this is just a food for thought at the end. Thank you. I don't know if you will use my slides, but I have the references at the end. So if you guys want to look at it, you can. Thank you. If you want to, yeah, sure, why not? But I can also provide the slides at the end, so. Sorry, then I have to.
Yeah. So we have some time for questions, so that is okay, Kata. Yeah, I think it is.
Oh my God, now, again, I'm the first one to ask a question. I'm Karen Celis of the Department of Political Science here and of the group Democratic Futures. Thank you for this amazing presentation and very, very, very important work. I am not a legal scholar, so this is, it's fascinating work, and I very much like the questions you ask. Also, they're very crucial questions, and of course also the answers you provide. If I would like to reflect on a few points from the perspective of political representation. I'm a representation scholar, and you asked a few questions that I think representation scholarship has a few has a few interesting answers to that might, I don't know, work. So here I go. So the first question, why children represent the future generations? And you also used other words like why are they the stewards? Why are they the advocates? And then the other question, or more the comment like, oh, but the future generations are not defined.
Yeah.
So and in representation studies, there's some really interesting thoughts on this that I would like to share. Mm-hmm. So the first one, why children represent the future generation? Might it not also be the case that there's this shared experience of being excluded based on not yet being a citizen with full political rights? Because in feminist representation studies, this shared experience is a very important reason for why somebody represents somebody else, and it defines the content. Yeah. So the interests that are formulated, prioritization thereof, and that then links to they make the most radical claims, and then thirdly also this. They can do it in a very legitimate way. Yeah. So these are all very important democratic goods. So then when talking about the benefits, well, all this, what they do, augments the democratic quality of our political debates. So which then also links to the point, rather than excluding them, and you have given a few really good reasons for why we should consider them, maybe then the better option is to seek a way to include them in a way that is productive and does not harm them. And then the second point, and that is a bit more teasing maybe, is like, the future generations are not defined. Yes, but actually they are defined through the claims that the youth is making. So this is the constructivist approach in political representation, and in that respect, future generations are no different than cyclists or farmers. a group that is constructed as having certain political rights. And that construction happens through the representation itself.
Thank you so much. Can I reflect already? Okay. So on the representation side and the shared experiences, I wonder if we can call it a shared experience because future generations don't experience. So that's from my understanding. I mean, we can say that they don't have this sort of status, but we cannot talk about their experiences because they do not yet exist. But I know that for many political scientists, starting from Edith Brown-Weiss, for example, the children are viewed as a voiceless group, and they are identified with other voiceless groups, including the future generations. And they view children as also as a proxy in time to future generations. So there is always another link between them, not only their shared experiences, but their age or their time proxies. That's what many scholars refer to. And they also say that, said in their arguments that children's rights could be a vehicle to provide rights to future generations as well. My question is always that, can it be the opposite way around? And in the Klima-Signorinen decision, I think it's the opposite way. So future generations, the considerations about long-term interests and future generations brought in the argument for children as well. But that's also a very interesting case because their future generations were represented by elderly people. And that's where my other questions come in, which I discuss in some of my publications. Who should carry this burden of representing future generations? Why does it have to be children? It can be any groups of the society, basically. Any other vulnerable groups or elderly groups who are also close in time, because they will basically, if they pass, the new generations come right after them. So how it's a concept that has so many different angles. But this shared experience is a very interesting one. And as a lawyer, I would definitely question whether future generations do have experiences in participation. No, they don't, from my understanding. But they, of course, they are marginalized in a sense. As are children, but as are also indigenous people or women or girls. So it's always a question whether how do we link, how do we establish this link? And I think it's just linking children and future generations together. It's more of a social construction. Maybe political construction as well. It carries political interests too, for sure. But not necessarily legal construction. That's what I would like to say. Yeah.
All right. Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I have many questions. I'll send them to you because I cannot ask them all. Yeah, there's definitely a difference in the way we look at it from a legal perspective and a political science perspective, because one of the things that I have also done some research on future generations and policy making, but we don't generally look at like the litigation part. And my feeling is like, it's very interesting, but it's kind of the very final step. Like once the principles of intergenerational justice have been violated or allegedly violated, then the legal scholars and the courts, they come in. But then the question is like, doesn't the key for guaranteeing the principles of intergenerational justice lie in actually involving young people early on in the policy process, before the policy is even made and can be contested? So do you have any ideas on how to involve them or how to involve younger people in the policy making process beforehand? And then relating to something that Karen mentioned, and you mentioned as well, is there's no clear definition of like who these there's no clear legal definition of who these future generations are. And I think once you get a definition, that definition will be contested as well, because you have future generations of rich people and poor people, future generations of boys and girls, future generations which are like the next generation, and then 500 years down the line. So basically, there's always a generation to be found that might feel offended or might feel hurt by a certain policy. And so it doesn't just stop with defining what future generations are, because there's a huge diversity among them. And also that is kind of a social construction, like what do we consider to be appropriate generations to represent, of course. And then I'm not entirely sure whether the shared experience argument holds up, because I once used it in a parliamentary meeting, and members of parliament actually told me, yes, but I have been a kid at one time too, so I know what kids want. And then it's different from like women's representation or gender and representation, because, well, as a man, I probably don't have the experience that women have. But politicians say, like, I have been a kid at one time, so I know what it is how it feels to represent children. So I'm not entirely sure whether the shared experience argument would be the strongest one to make in front of of politicians. Yeah, but I'll send you my other questions. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So in terms of how to involve them, or at an early stage already, and what we consider as a meaningful participation of children as citizens, as climate citizens. There have been many different models, pedagogical, social sciences, legal models, also on what is meaningful participation for children. In my research, I try to define it as opposed to the lived experiences of children, so what kind of obstacles they have and how these could be tackled, or how these should be considered by policymakers or those in power who can involve them, but then also by theorists. So, for example, in each chapter of my of the social context of in the book, I discussed the idea of what if children had the right to vote and to be involved in public matters that way, to be able to influence governance directly. And in that sense, I usually argue that it would not necessarily make a big difference, because having the right to vote does not mean necessarily that you can actually be involved in public participatory processes. So for children, it would definitely make sense to start it at the very beginning and providing them the information how they can use their rights. Not only for example, in climate change context, we talk a lot about climate education, but that educating them scientifically about climate change is not enough. Involving civil actors and children as citizens in environmental and climate change issues also entails educating and informing them about their rights, citizenship rights, so that they can decide whether they want to use it or not. So I think that's the first step. And then we can look at, of course, the institutional settings, frameworks, and guarantees. We can talk about it for days even, I think. But in reality, I would say that meaningful participation barely happens under the age of 18. and even above. So even youth groups are struggling to be involved or to being involved in climate governance. Because of ageism, because of marginalization, but also other groups of society. So I have come across with questions like why should children be involved and why not indigenous groups, or why not other groups of the society. So it's a discussion always who do carry the biggest interest and who are the most important stakeholders in these policies. I tend to also consider alternatives, the what ifs, and if you have mentioned the representation, I would also say that representation could be also an alternative for participation. But of course, it has to have a very stable framework and legitimate framework and legally, politically. So yes, it could also be a possibility.
I have a question concerning timescales. I'm Frank de Koning, and my training is medical physics, and I have been working a lot on the problem of radioactive waste and the potential impact on future generations. And then the question is, how many generations do you have to take into account? The industry will tell you 4 or 5, because the industry won't exist anymore. NG, ADF, etc., they won't exist anymore. And anyway, you may know your grandparents, but you won't know your grandparents. So they will not know who you are, and therefore they say, forget it. Then this is not satisfactory, of course. Then it said, yes, but why should our ethical values be imposed on the generation, say, 500 years from now? Because 500 years ago, they had different ethical values, which were as respectful as ours. So then you come to, say, the length of a civilization. But then the other thing is, yes, but there will be natural changes in climate, for example. On a time scale of, say, 10,000 years, we may have an ice age. So why should you care about future generations when the natural changes, independent of mankind, change it anyway, okay? So, and then the last, nearly finished, 100,000 years, mankind won't exist anymore. Homo sapiens didn't exist 100,000 years ago. And in medical physics and for radioactive waste, we have to show that the potential impact at 1 million years is negligible, which makes no sense at all. So what is your reasonable time scale for for generations?
You're asking something that I have never really, I wouldn't say I'd ever thought about, but I never really discussed in my research. Simply because I don't focus on future generations. I focus on children living in the present. But I think, I mean, I would probably, if you ask me personally, I would probably rely on scientific facts and studies on the long-term effects of current pollution. That could be a basis for a time scale, I suppose. But I think that for young people, maybe the first thing that we should consider that the currently living generations, how will they feel or suffer from the current harms that we inflict on them for the long run. And if we consider them in the first place, then it could be helping those to come as well. But it's a difficult question you're asking. I am not, in that sense, a climate scientist, and there are many even at the VUB, there are many studies on how children will be affected by climate change in the future. So you can even type in the age of the child and the geographical location of the child, and then you can have the result what, at the age of 50, 60 of that child or of the current child, they would experience in terms of climate impacts. And those could be, these type of calculations could be a very strong implications for those who make the decisions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kata. I would suggest
Yeah.
that we stop the discussion now. We have a short coffee break, then we come back with Catherine's presentation and then the Q&A. And afterwards, there's still also time to have, again, to open the floor to questions for Kata as well. Is that okay for you as well? Because you had a question, right? Because we can do it afterwards. Perfect. Great. Okay, so we see you back in 5 minutes. So don't run away. We have a second speaker.